And our next and final speaker is Pratik Chakrabarti from the University of Houston. He is the NEH Cullen Chair in History and Medicine, which is located in the Department of History. He received his undergraduate degree in history at the University of Calcutta before receiving his master's and PhD at the Center for Historical Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He's written widely in the history of science, medicine, and imperial history, and is the author of several monographs, including Bacteriology in British India, Laboratory Medicine in the Tropics, 2012, Medicine and Empire, 1600-1960, 2014, and most recently, Inscriptions of Nature, Geology, and the Naturalization of Antiquity, 2020, from which I have learned a great deal. Just to signal a couple of his contemporary interests with the titles of recent work, a lecture delivered to launch the Institute of Historical Research and UCL's Anthropocene Partnership Seminar in January of 21, Anthropocene and the Challenges of Deep Historical Imagination, and published in the Journal of the British Academy also in 2021, Towards a Modern History of Gondwanaland, which is done with Alison Bashford and Jared Hoare, with whom he's collaborating on a longer project. The title of his talk today, as you can see, Conserving the Past and Conserving Nature, Dual Perspectives from India.
Thank you, Peter, for the comment in introduction. I don't know how you got all this information about me from, but they're very kind and generous. And I wanted to also thank you for organizing this workshop, for bringing this diverse group of scholars together. And what we have done over the last 2 days is kind of think together. And that was probably your idea of putting these people together and think together. And I think to that extent, it has been a great success. And what has happened is my own presentation has changed in my mind, and I might give you a very changing talk, and please bear with me. I also wanted to record my thanks for Laura for all the work she has done, because organizing a conference, international conference in itself is quite a difficult task. Organizing one, I know from personal experience, in the time of COVID, and we are still in the time of COVID, although some people might deny it wrongly, is very complicated. And I'm sure she had to go through quite a few complicated processes, and you as well. So I just wanted to thank all of you for organizing this, bringing us together, opening up your hospitality, which we have enjoyed, and it has been a real pleasure. And I just also wanted to thank you all for staying on till the bitter end. I'm sure you have more exciting things to do on a Saturday afternoon, but life is such that you are in this room with us, and I will try to make your time worthwhile or interesting. So, I just wanted to say it's one of those talks or one of these workshops where I feel I'm a minority, so I have to kind of explain my my position here or my presence here. So as some of you know, I am a historian, and I'm a historian of science. And I'm not a conservationist, I'm not an architect, and don't work on our conservation as such. So what a historian has an advantage, which I always enjoy, is we can talk about anything. We don't talk about conservation, but we talk about the history of conservation. So we have a vantage point about talking about most things and standing back. So from that perspective, I will talk about the kind of the broad picture. So this is a slightly different talk from what you have heard. It is a broad picture of the history of conservation in India. And it's mostly the history of conservation in modern India, how what we have kind of heard evolved and through the processes. So it's kind of, you think about it kind of as a stand back and looking at it as a bird's eye view kind of a talk. Whether that bird's eye view is correct or not is something I do not know, but that's my bird's eye view of the history of conservation in India. There's something else I wanted to do in that bird's eye view that I wanted to give you, is talk about a kind of a different kind of a conservation, which we haven't actually talked about in these 2 days, which is about conservation of nature. And the reason I wanted to talk about conservation of nature as well is I believe that what we have talked about so far is conservation of cultural, religious artifacts, or various kinds of cultural artifacts. And I believe and that Ajanta cave was a fascinating image that Anupam showed, that conservation of artifacts is deeply linked to conservation of nature, and they go hand in hand. There are few reasons I would give you in as such as why conservation of nature, and I'll explain what I mean by conservation of nature if you bear with me. So, but there are a few reasons why conservation of nature is linked to conservation of the past or cultural artifacts. One is in India, the conservation of nature started around the same time, very much the same time as conservation of cultural artifacts. They almost start together, and there is a dialogue between the two processes that is significant in that history. There is also another link between the two, and that's a slightly complicated link, but imagine 23% of India's land is what is known as conserved or protected forest lands. And for more than 4 million people live in those lands. So for many of those people, those forests or those natural worlds are their cultural habitat. So the cultural property that we heard yesterday. So protection of forests is part of a protection of cultural habitat, if that's the kind of idea. So this is the kind of link that I'm trying to establish in that process. In doing that kind of broad history, I wanted to also talk about another facet about conservation, which we haven't touched upon. Sorry, it's too late to start new topics, but I'm trying to make your life more interesting at 4:30 p.m. on a Saturday evening. So the other part of the conservation that I wanted to talk about through the history of the conservation of forests that I'm trying to link is conservation of the indigenous people's cultural artifacts, which we again have not talked about. Aboriginal indigenous people who often live on those forests and lives, and what happened to their history and the politics of their conservation. So that's the kind of broad ambition that I have in presenting this talk. So to understand the dual process, so this is a dual process that I'm trying to convince you that you have to kind of imagine it is a dual process, that to a conservation of cultural artifacts and conservation of nature. So to understand the dual process of the conservation of nature and conservation of cultural artifacts, and particularly to understand or to imagine conservation of nature or conservation of forest lands almost as a similar process to the conservation of cultural artifacts, we have to understand a broad change that has happened from the 17th century in Europe, which then comes to India, about the change in the conception of what is nature. Because when you want to conserve nature, there is a certain change that happens in the imagination of what is nature. That change that happens in the imagination of nature from the 17th century, which is the birth of what you may have heard the phrase natural history, that there's a term that happens that nature becomes natural history, which means nature is not a product of the divine mind. Nature is not, which was the medieval or early modern idea, that nature is a product of the divine creation, that nature now becomes its own master. So nature has its own history. So natural history, the term natural history develops from that phenomena of observation of nature to see that nature has its own cycle of evolution, of own cycle of progress, of change. So nature is not governed by any larger mind, but it is governed by its own processes. What happens to the process, and that natural history comes with the British and the Dutch, particularly the Dutch, because the Dutch were quite prominent in this story of natural history from the 17th century. What happens is that there is a separation from nature and culture, because nature is no longer, so that tree is no longer a tree that the saint sat under. That tree is not known by the idioms or the mythologies of that tree. The tree is now known about by its parts, the branches, the leaves, the patterns, and then you compare those trees with various other trees in the global world. And the Royal Society, the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society, is bringing all those dried leaves or plants together and comparing them and putting a linear classification on that. Yeah, I'm just getting to history of science here, but what I'm trying to involve you that there's a new logic of nature that is evolving. What happens as a product of that new logic of nature, which is devoid from a traditional idea of cultural imagination of nature, is nature begins to be appearing as a resource, as an artifact, and to be exploited. So one of the logics of the conservation of nature is not nature to be conserved as a cultural artifact, but nature to be conserved as a resource. So one of the driving principles of the British conservation of nature, which goes through various acts of forestry, is to protect the forest for the timber, for the railways. So the protection of conservation of nature is only possible when you have separated nature from the cultural imagination of nature, made it into a resource, and that resource needs to be protected. And it is at the same time that there is huge deforestation. The railways are expanding in the middle of the 19th century, huge deforestation taking place, shipbuilding taking place. So there is a process, there's a resource pressure on nature, on forests. That is what presents this drive for the preservation of nature. So that drives me to the second point that I wanted to say is often conservation, whether it's nature or of cultural artifacts in the 19th century, is born out of an idea of destruction or of loss. And that destruction, it's amazing that in the 19th century, the Archaeological Survey of India, as others have said, was established in 1861, almost immediately after the revolt of 1857, which led to huge destruction of cultural artifacts. So it's that sense of loss and the sense of the romanticism that you were talking about that drives this this cultural protection of nature, this cultural protection of artifacts. And it's the same kind of loss that drives the protection of forests, not the cultural protection of forests, because they're saying that our resources of the forests are vital to us and they are being destroyed. So we need to protect that forest. I just wanted to share with you when this is happening, when 1861, the Archaeological Survey of India is established, and this sense of the British have established themselves as the rulers of most of India, and they have found ruins, and many of the ruins have been created by their own processes of colonization, but there were other ruins, and this sense of nostalgia that drives them in establishing the Archaeological Survey of India. And in that period, Mirza Ghalib, who was an Urdu poet, so he has a different notion about archaeology that he presents. And I'll explain to you that different notion that he writes. And this is not about the ability to recover, to conserve. Many things you cannot conserve. They are lost in the ground. So not all, only a few have become evident as tulips and roses. What may lie in the dark that remain hidden from us. So for him, imagine his writing. Mirza Ghalib is writing in the middle of the 19th century. He's seeing the decline of the Mughal Empire, the destruction of various of the cultural artifacts that his life and creativity was built on. That sense of loss cannot be recovered through a modern archaeological project, but because that sense of loss has gone. So there is no recovery in his mind in that archaeological process. So what I'm juxtaposing is the British archaeological dream is about the romanticism of the ruins. They want to resurrect those ruins. They want to rediscover those ruins. But in the middle of the 19th century, in the Urdu literature, there's a whole tradition of Urdu literature that develops, which is about ruins as destruction, as the end, as nothing to be built upon. They have been lost in the dust. So I just wanted to give you that sense of loss, the sense of destruction is not just about conservation. The sense of loss is a perpetual, permanent sense of loss that develops. So what about the conservation of nature that I have talked about? So the colonial era Indian Forest Acts of 1865, particularly 1878 and later the Indian Forest Act of 1927, had empowered the state, including members of the Imperial Forest Service, to act as the legal custodians of all forests. So by making nature separate from culture, the state becomes the protector of the forests. And the state is now protecting the forest, which systematically then excluded or disempowered the local indigenous communities living in this forest. So this is a very broad history, broad and quick history of Indian conservation of nature. But if you are interested in this, but this is kind of the broad narrative that goes on, that forests become the property of the state. And there are very interesting parallels that we can think about how cultural artifacts become the property of the state, and when they become the property of the state, when they become from a temple, from a community to the state, and how conservation makes properties a part of a much wider statehood or belonging to a particular organization that is separate from the community. And whether cultural artifacts stop remaining cultural artifacts when they enter a museum. The morning talk about the Nataraja, but from the temple to the museum. So it's almost the same, that forests become separated from culture and become protections of the state. The state is now protecting of the culture. And the conservation of past, which you have heard about, is 1861, and this is the Alexander Cunningham, who was the kind of the founding figure of the Archaeological Survey of India. And what is very interesting is that his work was entirely on the Buddhist remains. These are the Buddhist remains that. Can you see my cursor? Yes, these are the Buddhist remains that he finds. So the Archaeological Survey of India is established in 1861, primarily from the Buddhist remains. What is interesting is that the Delhi Archaeological Society is established before the Archaeological Survey of India. It's established in 1847. And I just wanted to tell you a story about how the Delhi Archaeological Society came to exist. And it's an interesting story. So the British occupied Delhi in 1801 from the Marathas, the beginning of the 19th century. This Delhi by then had declined to a much smaller city. So what they find in Delhi is these remains of the old Mughal Empire, what they find, and that is the lament of Mirza Ghalib that in the middle of the 19th century. But what they want to do is a very practical project. So Delhi is on the banks of Jamuna River. So, and the two rivers that are formed in that is Jamuna and Ganga, the two rivers. And the middle part is known as the Doab region. Doab literally means two waters. Doab, Ab is water, so Doab is a two region. What the British want to do once they have established Delhi as their center, and this is a story, it's a true story, but I'm trying to tell you as a story. So what they wanted to do in the 1810s onwards is develop agriculture in that region, or more agriculture. So what they wanted to do was build a canal system within the two regions, which is known as the Doab Canal Project. As soon as they started digging for the canal in between the Doab region, they realized there is an existing canal system. So Robert Smith, who was the architect of the Doab Canal, realized there is an actually existing canal system in that region. So what was an engineering project of building a canal becomes an archaeological project about restoring the old canal system. So so the whole, and that is where they start. Robert Smith starts. He was a brilliant painter. So this is the engineer is painting the canal systems, and so he then paints and the entire Qutb mosque restoration. So these are all Robert Smith's paintings, and I just wanted to bring them forward to show this is the ruins. This is the foundation of the Archaeological Survey of India. This is the kind of ruins that he builds and he sees and he paints of the ruins that he finds during the Qutb. Absolutely stunning, fascinating images that he produced. He's an engineer. Imagine, he's just an engineer who has now given up his engineering and has become a conservationist. So it's an amazing journey that he goes through. And I just wanted to show you this story about conservation that some of you might know. So this is the Qutb, the Qutb ground that I showed you. So this is the Qutb Minar in Delhi that becomes kind of Robert Smith's project of conservation. So he sees it and he wants to conserve the Qutb Minar. So what you see is at the top, this is a 1794 Qutb image of the Qutb Minar. So this has the older cupola on top. So there's an earthquake by the end of the 18th century when that cupola falls down. So then Robert Smith builds his own cupola on top. So can you see the, if you can't, that one on the top. So that was Robert Smith's own cupola that he built on the top. What happened, the problem was Robert Smith, before coming to the Doab region, worked in Bengal. So he was actually the part of the Bengal art. So that cupola was almost a replica of a temple architecture that he had imagined and put on top. I have no idea how in the early 19th century he actually put it on top of the Qutb Minar. So that is actually Robert Smith's cupola on the top of it. Then later on, they found that doesn't match the Qutb structure. Now, and that was removed. So now Qutb Minar is without that cupola. If you go to Qutb Minar, you might have actually visited, you will find at one corner, that cupola sits at one corner, a forgotten moment attempt of conserving Indian architecture by Robert Smith. But these are kind of the processes that I just want to share with you, that kind of ruins, the kind of restoration, the conservation, the broad picture. So what, the mistakes that we make, then the mistakes have often been made, not with any bad intentions, but these are the kind of processes through which Indian conservation histories went through. I just also wanted to show you, just wanted to tell you some stories about the archaeological project of the canal building project. So as I said, they found as they were building the canal network that there was an existing canal system. They started digging. So they started digging the entire region west of Jamuna. And some of you will be familiar with this landscape. And they found that there was a medieval 14th century canal network, the entire west of Jamuna. The problem was then they didn't know which was a canal, because this is quite a dry area. So which was a canal and which was a river. Because one of the ways that a ruler would build a canal and claim himself as a divine authority is to give the canal a name. Because I can actually make nature. You see, that is the kind of divine. So often these have, in the popular mythologies, have become rivers. And nobody remembers. So there's a whole landscape of rivers and canals that Indian archaeology had discovered, where you do not know what is a natural river and what was a canal, or a canal was used as a river, or a river became a natural landscape. So it's an amazingly complex landscape that the entire archaeological project had gotten into, had developed. And many of the practicing archaeologists, I'm sure, when they work on these kind of projects, are constantly confounded by these complex missing links about where the past gets lost. For the moment, I just wanted to change the track of this talk and go to something of a different discussion. So what I have so far told you is this broad stand back story about the history of Indian conservation. And I've also suggested the other aspect of the history of conservation, which is about the conserving of nature. Now, as I said, the broad picture is that from the middle of the 19th century, Indian forests were being protected as protected forest lands. And as part of that protected forest lands, the forests were protected to be exploited. It's an amazing, they were not protected to be protected, they were protected to be exploited. And as part of that protection to be exploited, the communities which were the tribal aboriginal communities that were often living in these forests, 4 million people live in those protected forest lands, were were denied of their traditional rights to habitat in that land because the land became part of the state. The state was allowing them to live and would withdraw that right to live if that forest becomes part of the state's requirement of cutting down the forests. But past is complex, right? That is one plain story. The other story that happened is many of the missionaries, the anthropologists, and this is where I think the broad picture that Peter had suggested about looking at conservation from the wider disciplinary convergences, were working with these tribal groups in various parts of 19th century. And what they were doing is collecting tribal artifacts. And this is where the collection of and conservation of tribal artifacts become important. So these various missionaries, anthropologists were trying to go against that kind of Forest Act logic and trying to understand these lives of these Aboriginal indigenous populations living in these forests. And so because they wanted to know who are these people, why have they lived in this forest for thousands of years, and they collected these amazing stories about the tribal Aboriginal stories about their own creations, and collected paintings which actually exist in the Nagpur Museum. So various Aboriginal artifacts. So they were, and this is a beautiful story about how the Gond race, which is one of the bigger tribal groups, came to exist, came to inhabit it. So what the anthropologists were doing without really realizing is they were reasserting the cultural within the natural. They were bringing those mythologies back to the state was doing something else. The state just wanted to exploit the forest, the teak forest, and exploit them for the resources. But there was a realignment that I have talked about of these cultural memories of these kind of traditional or of these groups that were being re-studied in times of the creations of the forests, and they were observing what is known as sacred groves, sacred forests of India. And there's amazing writings in the 19th century, and they can't place it. They said forests shouldn't be sacred. Forests are forests, they're wood. They're supposed to be for resources. Why do the people call these tribal people who live in those sacred primeval forests? So is there a different logic of conservation that has to be applied? That not conserve them as resources, but conserve them as cultural artifacts. So that debate is also taking place throughout the 19th century. I must add that that's a completely marginal debate in that way, because these are few individuals who are trying to talk about that kind of a cultural artifact of forest. The tribal population is moved out, huge parts of central India, primarily where most of the forests were brought up under agricultural expansion, cotton cultivation, oil seeds cultivation expanded. So there's a huge expansion of those forest resources that is taking place. But that element has remained, that element of study. So we often go back, if you want to study tribal mythologies now, these are the kind of 19th century resources, what we want to conserve. These are the 19th century resources of tribal anthropology that has remained that we wanted to study. So I just wanted to turn into a very contemporary story. Hasdeo Arand, a tranquil forested tribal area in Chhattisgarh in central India, is undergoing one of the most intensive coal mining expansions. The Adivasi groups have mobilized in protest and, among other activities, have marched 300 kilometers to the state capital of Raipur. Hasdeo Arand has become the center of tribal protest against the corporate appropriation of tribal resources in India. It is also emblematic of the global marginalization of Aboriginal people. There are strong similarities in these political mobilizations with other Aboriginal groups, such as in Australia. Those are often seen as the green-black struggles. Green are the environmentalists, black are the Aboriginal rights movements. So that logic of forests as resources or nature as resources has continued in the post-colonial period. And that has driven this whole regions being constantly exploited. So the question for conservationists is, what are we going to conserve? What is the loss, sense of loss that is going to conserve? So the loss is, in a way, not just the forests. And that is a critical point. The loss is not just the environment, the green. The loss is also forests as cultural artifacts. And it is that loss that needs to be understood for those to be conserved. So if we see them as forests, we see them as those nature devoid of culture, logic. And that would always have, we cannot put these people back into the forest. So one of the ways that logic has to be challenged, or a different idea of conservation has to be established. And these are the kind of movements, the marching that I talked about from Hasdeo Arand that's taking place. And these are amazing books if you're interested on seeing forests as cultural habitats of natural nature as culture. The project that I'm talking about is part of that project. So this is what I'm putting in front of the realigning of the conservation of historical and the natural. So if the historical, which is clear, the historical artifact that we have talked about, how can we realign the conservation of the natural? And I feel that it probably needs an alternative thinking of conservation, just to use the phrase of conservation. Understanding the past to link conservation thinking with land rights and political movements of the indigenous communities. Thank you.
Questions? I think yes.
Thanks very much, Pratik. That's terrific. And it's a really welcome expansion of the discussion, I think. I wonder if there's something to be said about the legal status of so-called tribal peoples and the use of laws, both under the British Raj and under the Republic, to criminalize indigenous communities, members of indigenous communities, just for their very way of life.
Yes, so the rule of law and the rule of property was a colonial project, and it came about, and criminal law. Many of the tribes were designated as criminal tribes for various reasons. Around the same time that the forest acts were also being passed. So you can see there's a pattern of forests becoming resources, and tribes and tribal populations becoming criminalized.
Yes.
So one of the problems that happened was, as a part of the colonial legislation, is the tribal populations that lived in the forest had no legal right to the forests. So it's only in 2006 the Forest Rights Act was passed. The FRA was passed in India, which for the first time recognized the tribal the habitat as your right to exist. The problem was, how do you establish the cultural property of the forest as your own? So how do you legalize what is something that is quite ethereal, belonging? So their sense of belonging to the land is not documented in any traditional forms. And what happened because of that is there was a claim by the environmentalists that a lot of people who were not traditionally forest dwellers were claiming those legal rights, which led to another legal battle. And I think 2019, there was a Supreme Court judgment passed saying that around 1 million people were actually illegal now because of using the 2006 Act had become, by legalizing their position, and they had actually lived in the forest or legalized their forest, which is leading to destruction of the forest itself. So that was the act passed in 2019, ordering around 1 million people, which was stopped, ordering around 1 million people to leave the forest lands. So it's a very complex process, and I do not know. So this is a debate whether legal procedures can process conservation thinking. So what is the relationship between legal procedures and conservation thinking? So can legal procedures ensure conservation is one of the questions that needs to be asked.
Great. Thank you.
I have a question about one of your images.
Mhm.
Lingo.
Yes.
What was the image on the left?
So, sorry, it's a long story, but I'll make it short. So, the legend of the lingo is one of the. Are you familiar with the legend of the lingo?
No, I'm just curious what century this image is
So
from.
this image, so again, this image is like one of those images. This is constantly repainted and repeated a circle. So this is almost if you go to a fair, a tribal fair, and I bought this image, not this one, but a copy, because there are several. So these are. So what has happened is the legend of the lingo, which was initially, these are oral traditions. So the priest would go from one village to other reciting this legend. So there was a missionary called Philip, I forget the name. Templeton, was it? So he was the first who wrote down from Gondi, the Gondi script, the actual legend of the lingo. So he actually, and then he translated it into English. So then that legend has become kind of the written specimen of the cultural heritage of those legends. And the legend is all about how the Gonds were born in the forest. So that kind of is a cultural, the cultural property. That's not a great term, but that is because it's now written down. So that, and most stories, most of the paintings, because apparently the legend says that the Gonds came from the crabs, from the birds, so they are products of the forest. Most of the paintings are kind of describing, reiterating that legend in various forms of Gond life coming from the lives of the forest itself.
What are Gonds?
Gonds are, okay, so
Is it a god?
Gond, G-O-N-D-S. So Gondwana land, Gondwana land as a geological category. So that word comes from, I should be closer to the mic. So that word comes from the Gondwana region of India. Gonds are one of the largest ethnic tribal groups in central India. And Vana means forest. So that region traditionally was known as Gondwana because it's the forest of the Gond. That became a geological category for different reasons because they found old rock formations. They call it the Gondwana series rock formation with Edward Suez. The Australian geologists then put together because he found similar rock series in Australia and Africa, Southern Africa. So he imagined Gondwana land. He did not know about the Gonds, but Gonds are the whole term comes from the Gond tribes who are now fighting for their statehood, and they have a party called. And that I wanted to show you those images. So they are called the Gondwana Ganatantra Party, the Gondwana Democratic Party. They're using these images. They're also using geological stories about Edward Suez's Gondwana land. There are YouTube videos if you're interested, saying that Edward Suez says that Gondwana land was an old geological land and we are products of the old geological lands. So we have a right to. So it's a very fascinating story about using modern geohistory as a claim for your political life. Sorry, you didn't ask for so much, but this is the long story.
Just a quick comment. I think, thank you. Thank you for that presentation. And to you, Peter, for inviting Pratik for this. Because I think as when art is concerned in India, whether it's crafts or it's intrinsically related to nature, from the practices, from the setting in which these things are there, and from the actual way of life. And I think it's not possible to remove one from either. Not only that, there are very strong connotations as far as forest produce and other things are concerned in the creation of the artifacts, whether it is the collection of the plant gums or the roots and the plants for making the dyes. We are seeing that since the Forest Acts were promulgated and there was this alienation of the actual people who were living there from the products and you could not get them, it's phenomenal how prices have skyrocketed. They can't collect more than that. So there are lots of aspects that are linked with this. Thank you. It's very relevant. And if Intact, when it started itself, it had three divisions: the cultural heritage, the material heritage, built heritage, and natural heritage.
Still,
Yeah.
the natural heritage is still.
It's still there.
So I wanted to ask a couple of questions. I thought that was really a wonderful paper and very elegant. So the first question is, the anthropologists who went into the forests after the Forest Act, were they sent by the British government? And if so, to do exactly what? Because it's not, yeah. And the second question is, I was struck by the way in which you kind of wrapped things up, because it pressed the paradox about the way in which the forests being protected were protected against the human inhabitants in this mindset, the colonial mindset. And it reminded me very much of our earlier discussion about ruins, where the crucial word, I guess, is encroachment, right? Which unites them both. And the assumption that the government adopting a kind of view from nowhere can defend the objects that cannot speak from the humans who can.
Yes. Yes. Oh, it's a fascinating point. On the first point, it's an interesting duality in colonial knowledge creation. So most of these people, Stephen Hislop, who was the missionary who settled. So Stephen Hislop, and they're all different. Stephen Hislop is a very kind of a middle of the 19th century Christian missionary, goes into the heart of India to start a missionary school. And then he starts so he has gone and other tribal students coming to his school, and he starts, but he's then studies the natural history, the Gone mythologies as such. So he's one of the missionaries who is trying to protect or try to study the tribes. Most others are part of the Geological Survey of India. So the Geological Survey of India is established in 1856, around the same time, 1856. And the Geological Survey of India's main project in that region is to discover coal. Coal is the main. So most of these geologists have arrived with huge entourage of, and there's a whole story about how they arrived to search for coal. What happens was as a search for coal, they also look and talk to the local people, because they know where the deposits are. And as they're doing, there's a duality that they have come to the forests for resources, but they're beginning to note and write down these mythologies and these ideas. So there is that duality of, and you often see this tension that they're, on the one hand, they're mining, on the other hand, they're discovering sacred groves. So, that the mining as resources and the sacred groves, and they just can't put the two together. They kind of live them. If you read their books, there's a mining chapter, then there's a sacred grove chapter. They kind of juxtapose next to each other. And it is for us to see those moments as almost, you cannot link the two in your mind in that, unless you have a critique of colonialism as a larger critique, which was not possible for that point. What was the second point? It was, yes. So that point of encroachment is fundamental in both that imagination of or the viewing of objects, and that is something that I've been thinking about, of the state being standing, and the British thought they were doing good. So the British, by passing those acts, believed that they were protecting the forests. But they also thought that the forests were to be exploited by the state. So the state's exploitation is for the good, for the general. We are developing India, we are bringing railways. So it's a part of the modernization project. They did not think we were exploiting. Nobody. So they thought the forests are to be protected from haphazard use, like cultural artifacts to be used as almost everyday lives, just take them to the museum and preserve them. So it's the same logic of preservation that worked for forests, taking the human everyday element out of it, give it to the experts. The forest department has the expertise to look after the forest. Brandeis, the German-born forest expert, then goes and studies those. So modern forestry is becoming part of the management. So it becomes, exactly, you conserve natural or cultural artifacts, you conserve forests. You need experts, and the local people who are dealing with them every day are not the experts, and they're taken out. And that state's role is it's, I think, in the book or the books that you think about is quite interesting. So how does the state look at its resources, both in cultural terms and in natural forms, that dictates how those are preserved. And the state kind of sees it as non-partisan in that, but its role is very critical in how those are protected.
But I wonder, and I don't want to belabor this given the hour, I wonder if there isn't also, not just from the exploitative view, I think, makes sense of the natural, but in terms of the archaeological, there is the whole earlier European and let's say circa 1800 art historical view that sees, for instance, the highest form of art as purely white marble sculpture, and often the polychromy is removed. And if you think about the way in which some of the paintings that Sanjay showed us, like the idea that artworks can be preserved while being used and discolored was not an option for a European trained student of the classics. And that's kind of a missing link in thinking about the history of object conservation.
Yes. So would it help? It might be a cliche, but would it help to think in terms of living artifacts or conservation of living artifacts, so forest as a living artifact, cultural objects as everyday living artifacts?
I mean, sculptures that are worshipped are living artifacts.
Yes. And that was throughout the day, because one of the things about India is the past is living. We have never the past is not disconnected from the present. And one of the ways to think about Indian conservation is their living everyday artifacts. And whether you want to put water in that, in the bagh, in the garden, is a choice about his imagination of what Shah Jahan would want. So he's making it living almost in that imagination. So it is about that kind of imagination of things being living.
Thank you very much. I think given the hour, we should stop. Our past of the last 2 days will live on as we migrate to the reception out through the door. I thank all of you in the audience, those watching in Zoom land, Jen Ha inside, Laura Minsky outside, and Pratik Chakrabarti at the podium. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.